The rain had not stopped for 40 days when Brother Thomas first noticed the changes in the catacombs beneath San Michele al Monte. He had descended into those ancient corridors every morning for 12 years, carrying his lantern and his prayers, tending to the bones of monks who had died centuries before his birth. The catacombs were his sanctuary, his responsibility, and his burden. But on the 41st morning, the bones were different. Thomas was not a man given to fear. He had grown up in the mountains of Lombardy, where winter killed the weak and only the resilient survived to see spring. He had buried his parents before his 15th year, had walked alone to the monastery through forests where wolves still hunted, and had taken his vows without hesitation or doubt. The dead held no terror for him. They were simply the future waiting patiently for the living to join them. Yet when he saw that the skull of Brother Benedetto had turned to face the wall, when he noticed that the femurs in the ossuary had rearranged themselves into patterns that seemed almost deliberate, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, precisely, more like recognition, as though some part of him had always known that the dead were not as still as they pretended to be. He said nothing to the other monks. San Michele al Monte housed 17 souls, ranging from the ancient Father Girolamo, who claimed to remember the siege of 1527, to young Brother Luca, barely 19, whose soft hands still bore no calluses from prayer or labor. They were good men, mostly. They rose before dawn, chanted the hours, tended the garden, copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, and observed the silences prescribed by their order. Thomas had no desire to disturb their peace with his observations. Perhaps he had imagined the changes. Perhaps the lantern light had played tricks on his aging eyes. He was 43 now, after all. Old enough that his knees ached when he climbed the stairs from the catacombs. Old enough that he sometimes forgot the words to prayers he had recited 10,000 times. But the next morning, more bones had moved. This time, he could not dismiss it as imagination. The entire northeastern section of the catacombs had been rearranged. Skulls that had rested in niches for centuries now sat in the center of the corridor, arranged in a perfect circle. Rib bones had been laid out in radiating patterns, like the petals of some grotesque flower. And in the middle of it all, scratched into the stone floor in what looked like dried blood, were words in a language Thomas did not recognize. He stood there for a long time, his lantern trembling in his hand, trying to understand what he was seeing. The catacombs were locked at night. He possessed the only key. No one could have entered, no living person, at least. The thought arrived fully formed in his mind, and he did not try to dismiss it. Thomas had spent too many years in contemplation, too many hours in the silence of his own thoughts, to lie to himself now. Whatever was happening in the catacombs was not the work of the living. He climbed back up to the monastery, his legs heavy, his mind turning over possibilities he had never before considered. The morning light seemed harsh after the darkness below, and the sounds of his brothers preparing for prime struck him as absurdly normal. Brother Paolo was coughing again, the same wet cough that had plagued him all winter. Brother Francesco was arguing with Brother Matteo about the proper way to prune the olive trees. Father Girolamo shuffled past, his ancient eyes focused on something invisible, his lips moving in constant prayer. Thomas joined them for the service, his voice blending with theirs in the familiar chants. But his thoughts remained below, in the darkness, circling the question he could not answer. What did the dead want? The monastery had been built in 1243, erected on the ruins of something older. The catacombs predated the monastery by at least 2 centuries, possibly more. They had been discovered during the initial construction, a vast network of corridors and chambers carved into the mountain itself. The builders had considered filling them in, but the local bishop had decreed that they should be sanctified instead, transformed into a proper resting place for the holy dead. Over the centuries, hundreds of monks had been laid to rest in those corridors. Their bones had been carefully arranged, their skulls marked with their names and the dates of their deaths. It was a place of peace, or so Thomas had always believed. a place where the soul's departure left only empty shells behind, meaningful only as reminders of mortality and the promise of resurrection. But if the dead were moving, if they were writing messages, then perhaps they were not as departed as the church taught. Thomas spent the day in a state of distracted anxiety. He burned the bread he was supposed to be baking for the evening meal. He stumbled over his words during sext, earning a sharp look from Father Girolamo. He cut his thumb while trimming candles and had to bind it with cloth torn from his robe. Brother Luca approached him after none, his young face creased with concern. Thomas waved him away, claiming fatigue, claiming age, claiming anything but the truth. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he speak of moving bones and mysterious inscriptions without sounding like a man touched by madness? That night, he lay awake in his cell, listening to the wind howl around the monastery walls. San Michele al Monte stood at the summit of a mountain that the locals called Monte della Morte, the Mountain of Death. The name was old, predating even the Roman occupation. No one remembered why it had been given, though there were stories. There were always stories in these mountains. Some said that an ancient people had performed sacrifices on the summit, offering blood to gods whose names had been forgotten. Others claimed that a battle had been fought here, so terrible that the ground itself had been poisoned by the slaughter. Still others whispered that the mountain was a thin place, where the barrier between the living world and the realm of the dead grew permeable, where things could cross over that should remain locked away. Thomas had dismissed such tales as peasant superstition. But lying in his narrow bed, listening to the wind that sounded almost like voices, he wondered if perhaps the peasants had known something the monks had forgotten. He rose before dawn, unable to bear the waiting any longer. He took his lantern and his key and descended once more into the catacombs. The bones had moved again. This time, they had formed shapes that Thomas recognized. Symbols from the old manuscripts in the library, the ones written in languages that predated Latin, that dealt with subjects the church had condemned as heretical. He had seen such symbols only once, in a book that Father Girolamo kept locked in a chest, a book that was supposedly too dangerous for younger monks to read. Thomas stood in the center of the corridor, surrounded by patterns made of human remains, and felt his understanding of the world shift beneath him like unstable ground. Everything he had believed about death, about the soul, about the nature of what came after all of it, suddenly seemed questionable. He heard a sound behind him and spun around, his lantern swinging wildly. Nothing, only shadows and more bones. But he could have sworn he heard breathing. Slow, labored breathing, like someone drawing air through damaged lungs. Thomas backed away, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was not a fearful man, he reminded himself. He had faced wolves and hunger and the slow death of winter. He could face this. But when the skull of Brother Benedetto turned to look at him, its empty sockets somehow full of awareness, Thomas ran. He fled up the stairs, his sandals slapping against stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He burst through the door at the top and slammed it behind him, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely turn the key in the lock. The morning light was just beginning to creep over the mountains. In an hour, the bell would ring for lauds. The other monks would rise, wash their faces in cold water, and gather in the chapel to sing praises to a God who promised resurrection and eternal life. Thomas leaned against the locked door and wondered what resurrection truly meant. If the dead could move, if they could arrange themselves into patterns and turn their skulls to watch the living, then were they truly dead at all? Or were they something else, something caught between states, neither fully gone nor fully returned? He should tell Father Girolamo. The old monk had lived through things Thomas could barely imagine. The siege, the plague years, the famines. If anyone would know what to do, it would be him. But when Thomas found Father Girolamo in the chapel, kneeling before the altar in private prayer, he could not make himself speak. The old monk looked so peaceful, his weathered face turned upward toward the crucifix, his lips moving in whispered devotion. Thomas could not bear to disturb that peace with tales of moving bones and watching skulls. Instead, he went to the library. The library of San Michele al Monte was small but precious, containing manuscripts that dated back to the monastery's founding and beyond. Most were religious texts, copies of scripture, and the writings of the church fathers. But there were others, books acquired through donation or conquest or simple accident, that dealt with subjects the church viewed with suspicion. Thomas had never paid much attention to these darker volumes. His interests had always tended toward the practical histories, agricultural treatises, medical texts. But now he searched the shelves with desperate focus, looking for anything that might explain what was happening in the catacombs below. He found it in a slim volume bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age. The text was in Latin, but an older form than he was accustomed to reading, full of archaic constructions and unfamiliar vocabulary. It was a treatise on the nature of death, written by a monk whose name had been deliberately scratched out of the manuscript. According to the author, death was not a single event, but a process. The soul did not depart the body instantly but lingered, tethered by invisible threads to the physical form it had once inhabited. In most cases, these threads dissolved naturally over time, allowing the soul to complete its journey to whatever awaited it beyond the mortal realm. But sometimes, the threads persisted. Sometimes, through violence or unfinished business or simple strength of will, the soul remained bound to its bones. And in places where many dead gathered, where the barrier between worlds grew thin, these lingering souls could exert influence on the physical realm. They could move their bones, they could write messages, they could watch the living with empty sockets that were not truly empty at all. Thomas read until his eyes burned, until the morning light gave way to afternoon shadows. The manuscript spoke of rituals that could sever the threads, prayers that could release the trapped souls, but it also warned of dangers. Some souls did not wish to be released. Some had grown to prefer their half-existence, had developed hungers and desires that the living could scarcely imagine. And some souls, the manuscript suggested in oblique and fearful language, were not human souls at all. Some were older things, entities that had existed before humanity, that had learned to wear human bones like clothing, that waited in the darkness for opportunities to cross over into the world of the living. The text ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the author had been interrupted, or as though he had realized the futility of trying to put certain knowledge into words. Thomas closed the book with trembling hands. Outside, the bell rang for vespers. He had been reading for hours, so absorbed that he had missed both terce and sext. The other monks would have noticed his absence. They would ask questions. He returned the book to its shelf and went to join his brothers in the chapel. They sang the evening psalms, their voices rising in harmony, and Thomas tried to find comfort in the familiar words. But all he could think about were the bones below, arranging themselves into patterns, writing messages in languages that predated Christianity itself. After the service, Father Girolamo approached him. The old monk's eyes were sharp despite his age, missing nothing. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, to confess what he had seen. But before he could form the words, Father Girolamo placed a withered hand on his shoulder and said something that made Thomas's blood run cold. The old monk told him that he already knew about the bones. He had known for 50 years. And he said that tomorrow, Thomas would understand why they had kept it secret, why they had allowed it to continue, and why the monastery could never be abandoned, no matter what horrors stirred in the darkness below. That night, Thomas did not sleep. He lay in his cell, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the monastery settling around him. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every distant sound seemed pregnant with meaning. When the bell rang for matins, he rose with the others and filed into the chapel for the midnight prayers. But his mind was not on the liturgy. He watched Father Girolamo, trying to understand what the old monk had meant. What secret had been kept for half a century? What horror had they permitted to continue? After matins, when the other monks returned to their cells for a few more hours of sleep before lauds, Father Girolamo beckoned to Thomas. The old monk led him not to the catacombs, as Thomas had expected, but to a small room at the back of the monastery, a chamber Thomas had never entered before. Inside was a desk, a chair, and a shelf containing perhaps a dozen books. Father Girolamo lit a candle and gestured for Thomas to sit. Then he told Thomas the truth about San Michele al Monte. The monastery had not been built to serve God, though it had certainly been consecrated for that purpose. It had been built to contain something. The catacombs below were not simply a burial place. They were a prison. In the years before Christ, the people who had lived on this mountain had worshipped entities that were neither gods nor demons, but something else entirely. Beings that existed in the spaces between life and death, that fed on the energy released when souls departed from bodies. The ancient peoples had learned to appease these entities through sacrifice, offering them blood and flesh in exchange for protection and power. But when Rome came, bringing new gods in new ways, the old practices were suppressed. The entities were driven back, sealed away in the mountain itself through rituals that combined the old magic with the new religion. The catacombs had been carved as part of this sealing, creating a labyrinth that would confuse and contain the entities, preventing them from reaching the surface. For centuries, the seals had held. But nothing lasts forever. Slowly, over generations, the entities had been breaking free. They could not yet leave the catacombs, but they could influence the physical world within them. They could move the bones of the dead. They could write messages. They could call out to the living, trying to lure them down into the darkness. The monastery had been built to maintain the seals, to ensure that monks would always be present to perform the necessary rituals, to guard against the day when the entities might finally break free. Every abbot of San Michele al Monte had known this truth. They had passed it down from one to the next, along with the knowledge of how to strengthen the seals, how to recognize when the entities were growing stronger, how to protect the monks who did not know what they guarded. Father Girolamo had been maintaining the seals for 50 years, but he was dying. The wet cough that plagued Brother Paulo was nothing compared to the corruption eating away at the old monk's lungs. He had perhaps weeks left, perhaps only days. And before he died, he needed to pass the responsibility to someone else. He had chosen Thomas. Thomas sat in stunned silence as the old monk explained the rituals he would need to perform, the prayers he would need to recite, the signs he would need to watch for. It was overwhelming, impossible. How could he, a simple monk who baked bread and tended bones, be expected to hold back entities that had existed since before human civilization? But even as he thought this, Thomas knew he would accept. He had spent his entire adult life at San Michele al Monte. This was his home, his purpose. If it required him to become something more than a simple monk, then that was what he would do. Father Girolamo taught him through the remaining hours of darkness. By the time the bell rang for lauds, Thomas's head was swimming with Latin phrases and symbolic gestures, with the names of forgotten saints and the properties of various herbs and metals. It was a different kind of theology than he had learned in his novitiate, one that acknowledged powers the church publicly denied. The next several days passed in a blur of instruction. Father Girolamo drove Thomas relentlessly, packing decades of knowledge into whatever time they had remaining. They descended into the catacombs together, and the old monk showed Thomas the seal's intricate patterns carved into the stone, so worn by age that they were nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Some of the seals had been damaged. Thomas could see where bones had been deliberately placed to cover them, where the carved patterns had been scratched and marred. The entities were trying to destroy their own prison, working through the bones of the dead. Father Girolamo taught Thomas how to repair the seals, how to reinforce them with prayer and ritual. It was exhausting work, both physically and spiritually. Thomas could feel something pushing back against him as he worked, a presence that was vast and cold and utterly alien. It hated him. It hated all living things. And it was patient, so patient, willing to wait decades or centuries for the moment when the seals finally failed. On the seventh night of Thomas's instruction, Father Girolamo collapsed during Compline. The old monk's face went gray, his breathing shallow and rapid. Brother Paolo and Brother Matteo carried him to his cell while Thomas sent young Brother Luca running for the physician who lived in the valley below. But they all knew it was too late. Father Girolamo was dying, and there was nothing any physician could do to prevent it. Thomas sat with him through the night, holding the old monk's withered hand, listening to his labored breathing. Just before dawn, Father Girolamo opened his eyes one final time. He looked at Thomas with an expression that might have been pity or might have been relief, and he whispered something that Thomas barely caught. He told Thomas that the entities were not evil, not in any way that humans could understand. They simply were, like fire or flood, forces of nature that existed beyond human morality. They would consume the world if they could, not out of malice, but simply because that was their nature. And then Father Girolamo died, and Thomas was alone with the responsibility of containing forces that could end the world. The funeral was held 3 days later. All 17 monks gathered in the chapel as Father Girolamo's body was blessed and prepared for burial. According to tradition, he should have been laid to rest in the catacombs below, his bones joining the hundreds who had served San Michele al Monte before him. But Thomas could not bring himself to take the old monk's body down into that darkness. He could not bear the thought of Father Girolamo's bones becoming another piece in the entity's games, another tool they might use to scratch away at the seals. Instead, he had the body interred in the small cemetery outside the monastery walls. Some of the older monks objected, citing tradition and protocol, but Thomas invoked his authority as the monastery's new abbot. Father Girolamo had named him the successor in those final moments, though few of the other monks knew the true significance of that appointment. Thomas discovered that being abbot meant more than simply maintaining the seals. It meant managing the monastery's daily operations, settling disputes between monks, corresponding with the bishop, overseeing the gardens and the library and the scriptorium. It meant very little time for sleep and even less for the contemplative prayer that had drawn him to monastic life in the first place. But he maintained the seals. Every night after Compline, when the other monks had retired to their cells, Thomas descended into the catacombs. He walked the corridors by lantern light, checking each seal, repairing the damage, reciting the prayers that Father Girolamo had taught him. And every night, the entities pushed back harder. Thomas could feel them growing stronger. The seals that had held for centuries were failing, worn down by time and by the constant assault from below. He repaired them as best he could, but it was like trying to patch a dam with his bare hands, while a flood pressed against the other side. The bones moved more frequently now. Entire sections of the catacombs would be rearranged overnight. The messages written in blood became longer, more complex. Thomas still could not read them, but he could sense the meaning beneath the unfamiliar characters. They were promises and threats, bribes and warnings. The entities wanted out. They had been imprisoned for so long. If Thomas would only let them pass, they would give him anything he desired. Power, knowledge, immortality. They whispered these offers through the bones of the dead, through the very stones of the mountain itself. Thomas ignored them and worked. But he was only one man, and he was aging. The years passed, and Thomas felt them in his bones, in the pain that shot through his back when he bent to repair a seal, in the way his hands shook when he traced the sacred patterns. He needed help. He needed to train a successor, just as Father Girolamo had trained him. But how could he choose? He looked at his fellow monks and saw good men, devoted men, but none who seemed capable of bearing the weight of this knowledge. Brother Paolo was too frail, dying slowly of the same lung disease that had claimed Father Girolamo. Brother Matteo was strong but simple-minded, better suited to physical labor than spiritual combat. Brother Francesco was clever but skeptical, likely to dismiss the entities as hallucinations or metaphors. Young Brother Luca was the only possibility. He had the faith and the intelligence, and he was young enough that he might guard the seals for decades after Thomas was gone. But could Thomas bear to burden someone so young with this terrible knowledge? He delayed the decision, year after year, telling himself he would choose when the time was right. But time was running out faster than he had imagined. Thomas was 61 when he first felt the entities touch his mind directly. He was in the catacombs, repairing a seal that had been badly damaged, when suddenly he was no longer alone in his own thoughts. Something vast and ancient pressed against his consciousness, and for a moment he saw the world as they saw it. He saw humanity as a brief flicker of light, rising and falling in the span of a few heartbeats. He saw civilizations crumbling to dust, mountains worn down by wind and rain, stars burning out in the distant heavens. He saw death not as an ending, but as a transformation, a shedding of one form to take on another. And he saw the entities themselves, not as monsters, but as shepherds, guiding souls from one state of existence to the next. They were necessary, they insisted. They were part of the natural order. By imprisoning them, humanity had disrupted the cycle of death and rebirth. Souls that should have moved on were trapped, lingering in a state of confusion and suffering. The vision released him, and Thomas fell to his knees, gasping. His lantern had gone out. He was surrounded by darkness and the presence of the dead. Slowly, with shaking hands, he relit his lantern. The flame seemed pitifully small against the weight of the darkness around him, but it was enough. It was always enough. He finished repairing the seal and climbed back up to the monastery, his mind churning with doubt. What if the entities were right? What if imprisoning them caused more harm than releasing them would? But then he thought of the ancient peoples who had sealed them away, who had combined the old magic with the new religion to create the prison. They must have had good reasons. They must have known what would happen if the entities were allowed to roam free. Thomas chose to trust the judgment of those long-dead ancestors. He would maintain the seals, no matter what doubts plagued him. But the encounter had weakened him in ways he did not fully understand. His sleep became troubled, filled with dreams of vast spaces and endless falling. He would wake in the night to find himself standing in the corridor outside his cell, with no memory of how he had gotten there. Once, he woke to discover that he had walked all the way to the door leading down to the catacombs, his hand on the key. The entities were trying to control him, to turn him into a tool for their escape. Thomas redoubled his prayers, his fasts, his meditations. He slept less and worked more, driving his aging body to its limits. Brother Luca noticed the change. The young monk, now in his 30s and no longer so young, approached Thomas with concern in his eyes. He asked if the abbot was ill, if there was anything he could do to help. Thomas looked at him for a long moment, weighing the decision he had avoided for so many years. Then, finally, he told Brother Luca the truth. The young monk's reaction surprised him. Brother Luca did not dismiss the tale as fantasy or madness. He did not flee in terror. Instead, he asked calm, practical questions. How long had this been going on? How many people knew? What needed to be done? Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had carried for so long that he had forgotten it was there. He was not alone anymore. He had an ally, someone to share the burden. Together, they descended into the catacombs. Thomas showed Brother Luca the seals, taught him the prayers and rituals, explained the nature of the entities they were containing. Brother Luca listened and learned with the same focused intensity he had brought to his study of scripture and theology. Over the following months, the two monks developed a routine. Brother Luca would maintain the seals every other night, giving Thomas time to rest and recover. The young monk proved to be naturally talented at the work, his prayers strong and his hands steady as he traced the sacred patterns. But the entities adapted. They had spent centuries learning to exploit the weaknesses of individual monks, and they turned their attention to Brother Luca with frightening intensity. The young monk began to have visions. He would see faces in the darkness, hear voices calling his name. The entities showed him things, promised him things. They told him that his devotion was wasted on a God who did not answer prayers, that they could give him certainty instead of faith, knowledge instead of hope. Brother Luca resisted. but Thomas could see the toll it took. The young monk grew pale and thin, his eyes acquiring the haunted look of someone who had seen too much. Thomas tried to ease his burden, taking on more of the work himself, but his own strength was failing. Then came the night when everything changed. Thomas woke from a nightmare to find his cell filled with whispers. The entities were calling to him, their voices urgent and insistent. Something was wrong in the catacombs. The seals were failing faster than he had thought possible. He threw on his robe and hurried through the dark corridors of the monastery, his old legs protesting every step. He found Brother Luca already at the door to the catacombs, his face white with fear. Together, they descended into the darkness. The catacombs had transformed. The carefully arranged bones had been scattered across the floor. The seals were not just damaged but destroyed, their intricate patterns obliterated as if by some tremendous force. And in the center of the main corridor, where Thomas had stood 1,000 times before, there was now a hole in the floor, a gap in the stone revealing darkness below. The entities had broken through. After more than 2,000 years, they had finally broken free of their prison. Thomas and Brother Luca stood at the edge of the hole, staring down into the abyss. They could see movement in the darkness, shapes that were not quite physical, forms that hurt to look at directly. The entities were rising, preparing to emerge into the world above. Thomas knew what he had to do. Father Girolamo had taught him the final ritual, the one that was to be used only in the direst emergency. It required a sacrifice, a life freely given to seal the breach, to create a barrier strong enough to hold the entities back permanently. He had always assumed he would be the one to make that sacrifice when the time came. He was old, his work nearly done. It seemed right that his death should have meaning, that his last act should be to protect the world from the entities he had spent decades containing. But before he could step forward, Brother Luca moved. The young monk looked at Thomas with eyes that were clear and calm despite the terror of the moment. He said that Thomas had borne this burden for too long, that it was someone else's turn to carry the weight. He said that Thomas had taught him everything, had shown him what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. And then, before Thomas could stop him, Brother Luca jumped into the hole. The young monk fell into the darkness, and Thomas heard him chanting the words of the final ritual, his voice strong and unwavering even as the entities closed around him. There was a flash of light so bright that Thomas had to shield his eyes, and then a sound like thunder, like the mountain itself groaning in pain. When Thomas could see again, the hole was gone. The floor of the catacombs was smooth and unbroken, as if it had never been disturbed. The scattered bones had returned to their proper places. The seals, though damaged, were holding. And Brother Luca was gone, sealed away in the darkness below with the entities he had given his life to contain. Thomas stood there for a long time, surrounded by the bones of the dead, feeling the weight of Brother Luca's sacrifice settle over him like a shroud. The young monk had saved the world, and no one would ever know. There would be no songs sung in his honor, no statues erected in his memory. The other monks would be told that he had left the monastery to join a different order, or that he had succumbed to illness. Only Thomas would know the truth. He climbed slowly back up to the monastery, his heart heavy, his mind numb. The dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. It seemed obscene that the world should be so beautiful when such horror existed beneath it. The days that followed were difficult. Thomas told the other monks that Brother Luca had been called away on urgent business for the bishop, that he might not return for some time. They accepted the explanation without question, too absorbed in their own duties to wonder at the abruptness of the departure. Thomas returned to his routine of maintaining the seals alone, but something had changed. Brother Luca's sacrifice had strengthened the barriers in ways Thomas did not fully understand. The entities were quieter now, less aggressive. The bones no longer moved, the messages stopped appearing. At first, Thomas was relieved, but as the weeks passed, relief gave way to unease. The silence from below was not peaceful. It felt expectant, as if the entities were waiting for something. Thomas searched through the old manuscripts in the library, looking for any reference to the final ritual, trying to understand what Brother Luca's sacrifice had actually accomplished. He found fragments, hints, but nothing definitive. What he did find was a warning, written in the same scratched-out hand that had authored the treatise on death. The final ritual did not destroy the entities. It could not. They were too fundamental, too woven into the fabric of reality itself. Instead, the ritual created a bridge, a connection between the living world and the realm where the entities dwelled. The sacrifice became the anchor for that bridge, holding it stable, preventing the entities from crossing over. But bridges could be traveled in both directions. Thomas read those words with growing horror. If Brother Luca had become a bridge, then it was possible he was not truly dead. He might exist in some liminal space between life and death, conscious and aware, trapped for eternity in the presence of the entities. The thought was unbearable. Thomas had to know. He had to find out what had happened to the young monk who had given his life to save the world. He began to study darker texts, books that the church would have condemned as heretical, that dealt with communication with the dead and travel between realms. He performed rituals in the privacy of his cell, speaking words that tasted like poison on his tongue, invoking powers he had spent his entire life denying. And slowly, carefully, he began to reach through the bridge that Brother Luca had become. What he found horrified him beyond measure. Brother Luca was alive in a sense. His consciousness persisted, trapped in the space between worlds. But the entities had not been idle. They had been studying him, learning from him, trying to understand the nature of the bridge he had created. And they were close to figuring out how to use it. The final ritual had not saved the world. It had only delayed the inevitable. The entities would find a way through eventually. And when they did, they would use Brother Luca's sacrifice as the doorway. Thomas knew he had to act, but what could he do? He was one old man, armed only with prayers and rituals that seemed pitifully inadequate against forces that had existed since before time itself. The answer came to him during Vespers, as he chanted the evening psalms with his brothers. The words were familiar, worn smooth by centuries of repetition, but suddenly he heard them differently. He heard them not as pleas to a distant God, but as affirmations of human will, human faith, human refusal to surrender to the darkness. The entities were powerful, yes. They were ancient and vast and utterly alien, but they were not invincible. The fact that they had been imprisoned for 2,000 years proved that. Human will, human faith, human determination, these things had power too. Thomas formulated a plan. It was desperate and dangerous, with almost no chance of success. But it was the only option he had. He would go down into the darkness himself. He would travel through the bridge that Brother Luca had become. And he would bring the young monk back, even if it meant taking his place. He spent a week preparing, gathering the materials he would need, studying the rituals, strengthening his mind and spirit for what lay ahead. He wrote letters to the bishop, explaining what he had discovered, providing instructions for what should be done if he did not return. He appointed Brother Paolo as his successor, knowing that the frail monk would not live long, but hoping he would survive long enough to train someone else. On the night of the new moon, when the darkness was deepest, Thomas descended into the catacombs for the last time. He stood in the center of the main corridor, in the spot where Brother Luca had made his sacrifice, and began the ritual. The words felt heavy in his mouth, each syllable requiring tremendous effort to speak. He could feel the entities stirring, their attention focusing on him like the weight of a mountain pressing down. The floor beneath him began to dissolve. Or perhaps he was dissolving, his physical body becoming less substantial, less real. The boundaries between himself and the world around him grew blurred and uncertain. And then he was falling, down through layers of darkness that seemed to have texture and substance, past walls that whispered and breathed, through spaces that existed at angles impossible in the physical world. He fell for what might have been seconds or centuries, time having no meaning in this place between places. And finally, he landed in a vast space that was neither a room nor a cave, but something else entirely. A pocket of existence carved out of the fundamental nothingness that underlay reality. The entities were there, surrounding him, their presence so overwhelming that Thomas could barely maintain his sense of self. They were not malicious, he understood now. Father Girolamo had been right about that. They simply were, forces of nature no more capable of kindness or cruelty than a flood or an earthquake. But among them, like a candle flame in a hurricane, Thomas sensed Brother Luca. The young monk's consciousness had been stretched and distorted by his time in this place, but the core of who he was remained intact. Thomas reached out to him, and their minds touched across the infinite distance of a few feet. Brother Luca was glad to see him. Not relieved or grateful, those emotions were too simple for the complexity of what he felt. But glad. He'd been so alone for so long, maintaining the bridge through sheer force of will, preventing the entities from crossing over even as they pressed against him from all sides. Thomas told him it was time to leave, time to return to the world above, but Brother Luca refused. If they both left, the bridge would collapse, and the entities would break through within days. Someone had to stay. They argued, their thoughts flowing together and apart in patterns that no spoken language could capture. Thomas insisted that he would stay, that Brother Luca deserved to live. Brother Luca countered that Thomas had already given his life to this fight, had spent decades maintaining the seals when he could have walked away. In the end, they reached a compromise that neither of them wanted, but both understood was necessary. They would both stay. Together, they could create a stronger bridge, one that would hold not for years, but for centuries. Their combined will would create a barrier the entities could not overcome, at least not in any time frame that mattered to human civilization. It meant giving up everything. Their lives, their humanity, their hope of resurrection and reunion with the God they had spent their lives serving. They would exist forever in this liminal space, neither alive nor dead, holding back forces that wanted nothing more than to consume the world above. But what choice did they have? They were monks. They had taken vows to serve, to protect, to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Thomas looked at Brother Luca, and Brother Luca looked at Thomas, and they began the ritual that would bind them to this place for eternity. Their bodies in the physical world would die, Thomas knew. They would be found in the catacombs, kneeling as if in prayer, their faces peaceful. The other monks would mourn them and lay them to rest. Life at San Michele al Monte would continue, the monks rising before dawn to chant the hours, never knowing that two of their brothers stood guard in the darkness below, holding back the end of the world. The ritual took hold, and Thomas felt his connection to his physical body sever. He was no longer confined to flesh and bone. He was consciousness itself, will itself, faith itself. He and Brother Luca wove themselves into the fabric of the bridge, becoming the barrier between the entities and the world above. It was agonizing and beautiful, a kind of crucifixion that would last forever. But as the transformation completed, as Thomas felt himself dissolving into pure purpose, he realized something that filled him with a strange peace. This was what he had always wanted, though he had never known it. Not the specific circumstance, he would not have chosen eternal imprisonment in the darkness, but the essence of it, to be of use, to serve something greater than himself, to give everything he was to protect those who would never know they needed protecting. He was no longer Thomas, the monk who baked bread and tended bones. He was no longer even human, not in any meaningful sense. But he was at peace. The centuries rolled by, measured in the slow wearing away of stone, in the rise and fall of civilizations above. San Michele al Monte endured, generation after generation of monks maintaining the monastery without knowing what lay beneath it. Sometimes the entities grew restless, pushing against the barrier, but Thomas and Brother Luca held firm. They did not speak to each other exactly. They had moved beyond the need for words. But they were aware of each other, a constant presence, a reminder that neither was truly alone. And deep in what remained of their consciousness, they held on to a single hope, that someday Somehow, humanity would evolve beyond the need for their protection. That people would learn to accept death as a natural transition rather than an enemy to be fought. That the entities could be integrated back into the cycle of existence without destroying everything. It was a distant hope, perhaps an impossible one, but it was enough to sustain them through the endless dark. Above them, in the monastery, the monks sang their prayers and tended their gardens and copied their manuscripts, never suspecting that two of their brothers watched over them from the shadows, two souls who had given up everything to ensure that life continued, that the dawn would break each morning over the mountains, that humanity would have time to grow and learn and become something better. And in the deepest darkness of the catacombs, where no living person would ever walk again, the bones of countless dead monks lay in silent witness to the sacrifice that had saved the world. The monastery stood, as it had for centuries, a lighthouse in the darkness, maintained by those who believed in something greater than themselves. And beneath it, unseen and unknown, two guardians held their eternal vigil, neither living nor dead, protecting a world that would never know their names. This was their immortality. Not the kind that the entities might have offered, not power or knowledge or endless life in the world above, but something more profound, the knowledge that they mattered, that their sacrifice had meaning, that they had fulfilled the vows they had taken so many years ago. And that, in the end, was enough.